Thanks very much. It's nearly 4 years since I launched Volume 1 of this biography of E.G. Whitlam, and I'm honoured to have been asked by the author Jenny Hocking to launch today Volume 2. I'm glad that we national retreads continue to have our function and our purpose in the national political life. Much has changed in Australian politics since then, just as many things have not. The essential narrative of Australian politics has remained much the same for more than a century. Labour in government, the party of progressive economic, social and environmental reform, and of Australia's place in the region and the world. The Conservatives in government, invariably in the absence of a coherent policy program of their own, instead committed purely to the demolition of Labour's previous reform program. We in government have sought to build the house that we call the Australian nation. The Conservatives' energies instead dedicated to tearing the house down. Our ambition in office to prepare Australia for its future, their ambition in office, well, just to be in office. It's a bit like a bad rerun of Peter Sellers being there. Because this has remained the central organising principle for the Conservative political project for much of the century. Being in office, essentially for the purpose of being in office. And to this end, one of the great constants of Conservative politics has remained their utter ruthlessness in obtaining and sustaining political power. Which brings us to the important subject before us today, the government of E.G. Whitlam, 1972 to 1975. And we're honoured to have a minister of that government with us today. It is quite a shocking thing to read afresh the absolute political brutality of the dismissal. No conservative Edwardian manners on display here. No acknowledgement of political or constitutional precedent, notwithstanding the fact that the entire Conservative enterprise rests on an appeal to political and constitutional precedent. No, just a simple, naked lunge for political power when the opportunity presented itself. And not for the purpose of implementing any long-conceived Conservative policy project, but simply because power belonged to the Conservatives, because in the Conservative worldview, that was the natural order of things, almost a product of natural law. There were barely any achievements to speak of at all. For those who may doubt this proposition, a cursory examination of the policy achievements of the Conservative government between 1975 and 1983 is proof positive. Which brings me to the central point I wish to argue today in watching this important work. Namely, that down to this day, there is an absolute fault line between our respective political traditions and their approaches to the central task of politics itself. For all our faults, we in the Labour tradition, the party of the reforming centre of Australian politics, engage deeply in the core task of our policy platform, the costing of our policies, the complex process of transition to government, and in the execution of our reform mandate once elected. And we rightly are held accountable such things. Our Conservative opponents regard the core business of politics as a demolition derby, with the central task of delegitimising and destroying Labour. Rather than preparing, costing and implementing an alternative Conservative project for the country, theirs is a project of destruction, first and foremost. And all along, animating this deep division in the Australian political psyche and in the Australian political culture are two radically different political alchemies. The Conservatives calling forth the deep emotions of anxiety, fear and anger. Ourselves, while not exactly angels resplendent in celestial white, perhaps a little grey. By instinct, by inclination, by tradition, nonetheless driven to call forth the better angels of our nature, what we call the politics of hope, whereas the Conservatives engage relentlessly in the politics of fear. Fear of debt, when in Australia's case, there is no rational case for fear at all, given our relative global performance. Fear of foreigners. Fear of change itself, even when change is necessary for us to negotiate a global future full of relentless change. It is from these deep and enduring principles that the daily politics of our nation proceeds to this day. Let's look carefully at the Whitlam record. Let's look carefully at the reform of the party. Let's look carefully at the preparation of his policy platform. Let us look carefully at his meticulous arrangements for transition to government. And then the legislative record of the government itself. These are well documented in the volume we are launching today. In fact, it is Jenny Hocking's first volume that we read of Whitlam's courageous efforts to reform and modernise the party, which had not seen an electoral victory since 1946. Whitlam's policy speech of 1972 outlined a detailed 3-year plan of action, which we are told Kim Beazley Sr. dubbed the New Testament. Beazley, forever the theologian, by contrast dubbed the former party platform itself, the formal party platform itself, as the Old Testament. A neat theological distinction, underlining continuity, but pointing to a brand new message for a brand new day. Then there was Walensky's meticulous paper on transition to government. His further paper on the restructure of the Commonwealth public servants, which in structure itself had changed little since the days of Shipley, laying the foundations for what was to become the Coombe Royal Commission. While Whitlam himself, the son of a federal public servant, by instinct and by experience, reflecting his respect for the independence of the Commonwealth Public Service, elected to support the continuity of the senior public service mandate that he had inherited from his predecessors. A combination of continuity and change which in face belies much of the criticism of Whitlam's approach to the process of public administration. And there then, of course, followed the relentless pace of legislative and administrative action of the government itself. It is a remarkable thing, but by the time of Whitlam's election, the government of the Commonwealth had only changed as a result of national elections on 7 previous occasions since Federation. And only one of these occasions was within Whitlam's own direct political experience, the Conservative victory of 1949. A change of federal government elections therefore remains a relatively rare thing in the history of this country. Therefore, the policy program brought to our national elections is of a particular significance. Whitlam's was a most formidable record of domestic policy reform. The bold decision of a 25% across-the-board tariff cut, which we are told Whitlam described to a sceptical New South Wales Chamber of Manufacturing audience as evidence of the first genuinely free enterprise government in 23 years. The introduction of consumer protection laws against restrictive trade practices. The support for the equal pay case for women. The introduction of Australia's first universal health insurance scheme. The introduction of the Schools Commission's bill to underpin needs-based funding for Australian schools following the Commonwealth Report. The abolition of tertiary fees. The introduction of tertiary education assistance in order to deal with what Whitlam described as the national obscenity of only 4% of government school year 12 completions going to university, compared with 15% of private schools on a Commonwealth secondary scholarship. The introduction of the Racial Discrimination Act, Australia's first land rights legislation. The amendment of the Migration Act removed the racist provision that remarkably still required Aboriginal Australians to obtain permission to leave Australia. The abolition of conscription, the cessation of the prosecution and imprisonment of draft resistors. The formal embrace of multiculturalism as official government policy. The removal of the last elements of the White Australia policy by the removal of the privileges reserved for British white immigrants on the one hand, and the removal of discriminatory practices against non-white and non-British immigrants on the other. The exclusion of all racially selected sporting teams from Australia. The introduction of the Family Law Act. The creation of the Office of Women. Sensational at the times. A lifting of the ban on advertising contraceptives in the ACT. And the appointment of a women's policy advisor, the latter resulting in what Hocking delightfully describes as, and I quote her, a national outbreak of small man syndrome. We've seen a little bit of that around our nation in recent times. Also, the creation of an Australian honours system, the creation of the Australia Council, the commissioning of the National Gallery of Australia, the Australian Film and Television School, and most radically, think of it, the opening in 1974 of the FM radio lab. 40 years later, it's easy to forget what Australia was actually like prior to the election of the Whitlam government. Before 72, Australia was an inward-looking, by and large, Anglo-Saxon monoculture, suffering from an acute case of an international cultural cringe, sexist, in some parts racist, marching confidently towards a 19th century future. After 1972, despite the Conservative reaction of 1975, Australia had become a confident, internationally engaged multiculture, celebrating its diversity and carving out its independent place in the region and the world. The genie simply could not be put back in the bottle. And the core principle at stake in all of this is that politics properly conducted really does matter in determining the future of peoples, of cultures and of countries. What this demonstrates above all is that politics properly conducted really does matter. Then of course there's Whitlam's record of foreign policy. China, Japan, the withdrawal of remaining troops from Vietnam, the signing of multiple international covenants including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the independence of PNG, the closure of the Rhodesian Information Service here in Sydney, to the howls of protest from that leading Conservative luminary, Sir Robert Askin. And the government's success in obtaining interim injunction on French nuclear testing in the Pacific and the International Court of Justice, the first successful interlocutory injunction in ICJ history. One of Whitlam's most memorable marks on Australia's new identity in the world, he said the following, I quote him, "If anything came to an end on the 2nd of December, it was the demeaning of Australia in the eyes of the world as the country our predecessors had represented it to be. Insignificant, racist, militarist, sycophantic, a timid and unworthy creature of the great powers to whom it had surrendered its identity." Unquote. Finally, there was Whitlam's legendary commitment to electoral reform, and the government providing the vote to 18 to 20-year-olds at a time when you could be conscripted to sent to war by a Conservative government, but no, you couldn't actually vote in an election to vote for or against a Conservative political party, the one that conscripted you. And then his efforts to enshrine what we now regard as an unremarkable principle of one vote, one value for all federal electorates, in contrast to the previous system up until that 1972 election, which saw country party seats of 45,000 electors and metropolitan Labor electorates of 72,000 electors. It should never be forgotten that one of the brutal political reasons underpinning the Conservative campaign to demolish and destroy Whitlam was their fear, particularly from the National Country Party, that basic electoral justice would erode their monopoly on power. Of course, the Whitlam program ran headlong into the great economic and inflationary pressures of the time, which greeted his first year in office, brought about in large part by the massive oil price hike of 73-74. And the truth is, Whitlam failed to calibrate his detailed policy reform program against external economic realities over which neither he, his Treasury, or his government, or his country had any real control. This is a challenge for all governments, including the one which I was privileged to lead as well. But against the conventional Conservative critique of this part of the Whitlam record, Hocking reminds us of another inconvenient truth that should be borne in mind. Before the 72 election, the Secretary of the Treasury, Sir Frederick Wheeler, long-known revolutionary socialist, had presented McMahon with revised forward estimates on Commonwealth expenditures under the McMahon government that would see the highest percentage rate increase in government outlays in memory. And that was before McMahon's high-spending election commitments of the 1972 campaign. So much so that by January 73, with Whitlam in power less than 1 month, Wheeler was predicting a record deficit of just under $1 billion in a booming economy with mounting inflation. So the proposition that Whitlam inherited sound public finances from the Conservatives is open to significant challenge, causing us to reflect on events just over a decade later when Hawke and Keating inherited an even greater deficit from the preceding Conservative government of Fraser and Howard. Nonetheless, the overall point is this. Notwithstanding the major challenges of global macroeconomic policy which dogged the Whitlam government to its turn, and to which the government failed to calibrate its program effectively, the breadth of his enduring reform program, that of his government, remains with us today. Of course, the Whitlam government is both a tale of triumph and a tale of tragedy. Neither Whitlam nor any of his successors are deserving of hagiography. But whatever might be concluded about the failings of his government, there is little disagreement that there was nothing in the performance of the Whitlam government that warranted the unconstitutional actions taken by the Conservatives to bring down his government. As Hocking starkly observes on page 61 of her book, if the government's sole political strategy was to implement its program, the opposition's was equally simple and singular, to use its numbers in the Senate to remove the Whitlam government. Nor was there any secrecy in the opposition's political strategy. In his address in reply to the Governor-General's speech, the Leader of the Opposition in the Senate, Senator Withers, articulated this uncomplicated process: deny the legitimacy of the Whitlam government, deny the reality of its election victory, deny the mandate and use the powers of the Senate to remove what he considered an abhorrent government. And I quote Withers, The Senate may well be called upon to protect the national interest by exercising its undoubted constitutional rights and powers. And let's not forget, Withers said this on behalf of the coalition in early 1973, before anybody had heard of anything remotely approaching the loans affair. Withers argued that the electorate was, and I quote him, unaware of the implications of its decision in the 1972 election, and furthermore that the election result was, quote, temporary political insanity, unquote. Withers further argued that the concept of electoral mandate was, and I quote him again, dishonest. This sounds more like the table banter of high Tory grandees during the time of Queen Victoria, reflecting on the poor judgment of the lower orders. But no, this was the Conservative leader in the Australian Senate in the 1970s, not that long ago. Hocking also recounts the extraordinary story of the Governor of Western Australia, Sir Douglas Kendrick. I draw it to your attention, a part of our history often forgotten over east. 40 years later, this is all extraordinary stuff. But as we saw with the decision by the Conservative government in Queensland of Joh Bjelke-Petersen, they sought to change the numbers in the Senate by appointing Albert Patrick Field to replace the late Senator Bert Milner. These were not simply idle Conservative speculations over whiskies and sodas in a gentleman's club. They actually went about and did it. In what I believe to be one of the most impressive sections of Hocking's book, she analyses the conservative strategy to delegitimise the Whitlam government in order to create a sufficient climate of crisis to either force the government to the polls or, as indeed it turned out, to induce the Governor-General who replaced Hazlitt, Sir John Kerr, to dismiss the government. To quote Hocking again, illegitimacy became the prism through which the normal activities of government, from appointees to policies, were seen. This was more than just a difference in political tone or disagreement over policy. It was a different vocabulary altogether, one that effectively closed off normal political debate, as arguments over policy options or differences between the parties or over specific government decisions were reduced to claims of fundamental legitimacy. A linguistic continuum emerged from self-interest to incompetence, from impropriety to corruption and even criminality. Of course, all this comes very much from the universal Conservative playbook, not just then, but now as well. Not just in Australia, but also abroad. But for the Whitlam government, of course, the rest is simply history. There's been much debate in recent days about who were the principal dramatis personae in the events leading to the dismissal of 11 November 1975. But the simple, stark truths remain. One, the Conservative opposition by and large manufactured a climate of unresolvable political crisis in late 75. Two, on this basis they moved to block supply. Three, they refused to allow the matter to come to a vote in the Senate because they knew their own numbers would crumble. Four, the proper constitutional course was for the matter to be resolved through a half-Senate election, which was due by June 76 in any case. And five, they could not allow such an election to occur, given that a recent High Court decision made it lawful to elect at least 2 senators from each of the 2 territories, and the likelihood that this in itself would break the Senate half-Senate supply. Hocking quotes Paul Kelly's key observation at the time, when he wrote, he was here today, Paul. There is no more specious argument than the claim that the Senate has an obligation to force an unpopular government to the polls. All governments at one time or another are unpopular. This approach simply ensures that unless a government has full control of both houses, it will be struck down at its weak point and denied the traditional 3 to 4 year term, fundamental to sound government in most countries. To conclude, what does all this have to say for those of us involved in the mire of Australian politics today? Well, quite a lot actually. As I noted at the beginning of my remarks today, there are certain continuities that run through the veins of our national political discourse. When the Australian Labor government was elected in 2007, it was elected on the basis of a clear program of policy reform, including a new approach to productivity driven by new large-scale investments in skills, education, training and infrastructure, including a national broadband network, an education revolution, health and hospitals reform, an apology to Indigenous Australians, the ratification of Kyoto, a renewable energy target of 20%, a price on carbon, the abolition of work choices, and a new and active foreign policy in our region of the world. And the government continues to implement a program of reform under Prime Minister Gillard, including a national disability insurance scheme of far-reaching importance for our people. And since the very month of the government's election at the end of 2007, we've had to weather the worst global economic crisis and financial crisis since the Great Depression, successfully avoiding recession and mass unemployment. The normal business of government is hard. The business of a reforming government is even harder. And to that, add a global economic crisis, it becomes harder again. By contrast, however, this approach differs from that of our Conservative opponents. Both the 2007 and 2010 Conservative election campaigns were simply attempted demolition derbies once again against the Australian Labor Party. In 2007, this was designed to mask the fact that the Howard government had become the highest taxing government in Australia's history, interest rates were at record highs, and an ideologically driven work choices regime was squeezing the life out of Australian families. And if you ask anyone today what Mr Abbott's program was for the 2010 election, we would all still be scratching our heads. What was it? Does anyone here remember? I can't. I follow these things. Remember, the Conservatives refused to submit their policies which they put forward in the 2010 election to any formal costings process. And as for the next election, they already start by their own admission to the $70 billion black hole. We have never seen any evidence of a transition to government process on the part of Mr Abbott or his team, nor has there been any alternative policy program other than the reintroduction of work choices, as Mr Howard in part argued earlier this week. No, there's none of that. Mr Abbott's entire program, in the tradition of his Conservative predecessors, is simply driven by a campaign of delegitimisation of Labor, opposing everything, proposing nothing, and to do everything possible to secure government by whatever it takes. And as one of the independents reminded us recently, Mr Abbott is willing to obtain political power at any price. And beneath all of this, Mr Abbott would hope that he would be taken on trust, notwithstanding the fact that Mr Abbott is the most extreme right-wing leader in his party's history, notwithstanding the fact that he has neither the temperament nor the policies to occupy the highest office of this country, the office of Prime Minister. And that is why I believe Mr Abbott is entirely beatable at the next election, because increasingly the Australian people see what it may mean to take a Conservative leader such as him on trust. The good people of Queensland are discovering this as we speak. I commend Jenny Hocking for her book. These 2 volumes have been a labour of love over many years now. I commend their subject, Edward Gough Whitlam, for all that he has given his country, and his former staff, his former colleagues, and his former ministerial partners who are with us today. I also commend and lament the passing of his life partner, Margaret, who has equally been an inspiration to us all. On all reasonable measures, Australia is a better place for their lives and their work.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. It's refreshing and uplifting to hear someone argue